When my daughter Celeste pulled that rusted military dog tag from beneath the truck's dashboard, we had no idea it would lead us to a 73-year-old veteran who hadn't spoken his brother's name in 50 years. What started as a simple restoration project became the most emotionally devastating discovery of our lives. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the most broken things we find aren't meant to be fixed. Sometimes they're meant to fix us instead. My name is Harper, and I run Brookfield Auto Repair in a small Oregon town where everybody knows everybody, except when they don't want to be known. 3 years ago, my husband died in a construction accident, leaving me to raise our 16-year-old daughter alone while keeping the family business alive. Celeste has always been my adventure partner, the kid who would rather spend Saturday mornings hiking unmarked trails than scrolling through her phone like most teenagers. She inherited her grandfather's curiosity and her father's stubborn determination to see things through to the end, even when the end might break your heart. Our weekend explorations became sacred after David died. They were the only times I felt like we were living instead of just surviving. That particular Saturday in March started like any other. Celeste had mapped out a new section of Cascade National Forest, and I packed our usual supplies, water bottles, trail mix, and my emergency toolkit because you never know what you might find in the woods. The morning air was crisp enough to see our breath, and the forest smelled like rain and pine needles. Celeste walked ahead of me, talking excitedly about a history project she was working on about local World War II veterans. "Mom, did you know there used to be a military training facility just 15 miles from here?" she said, pushing through a cluster of young fir trees. It was decommissioned in the 70s, but some of the old access roads still exist. I was only half listening, focused on not tripping over the fallen branches scattered across the barely visible trail. That's when Celeste stopped so suddenly, I nearly walked into her back. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing through the thick undergrowth. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Dense Oregon forest looks pretty much the same everywhere. Towering Douglas firs, thick moss covering everything, and undergrowth so dense it could hide a house. But then I saw it too. A flash of military green paint, almost completely obscured by decades of fallen branches and moss growth, but definitely man-made. We pushed through the brambles, thorns catching on our jackets, until we could see it clearly. A 1952 M37 military cargo truck, sitting in a small clearing like it had been carefully positioned there, and then abandoned to time. The vehicle was completely intact but covered in rust and vegetation. Moss grew across the windshield, and small saplings had sprouted through cracks in the truck bed. My mechanical instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just any old abandoned vehicle. Military trucks from that era were built to last, and despite the surface damage, I could tell the bones were still good. The potential value was significant, but more than that, it was a piece of living history sitting forgotten in the middle of nowhere. "How did this get here?" Celeste asked, running her fingers along the driver's side door. "There's no road. How would someone drive a truck this deep into the forest?" That question would haunt us for the next 3 months, because as we would soon discover, some things aren't abandoned by accident. Some things are hidden on purpose, carrying secrets that families spend decades trying to forget. And sometimes, when a curious teenager and her stubborn mother decide to restore something beautiful from something broken, they uncover truths that change everyone involved. The dog tag Celeste found that first day was just the beginning. By the time we finished restoring that truck, we had unraveled a 50-year-old mystery that would bring a war veteran to his knees and teach us both that healing sometimes requires breaking open old wounds that never properly healed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a simple Saturday hike turned into the most important thing my daughter and I have ever done together, and why a rusted military truck, hidden deep in the Oregon woods, made a grown man cry tears he'd been holding back since 1971. Let me back up and tell you how we got to that moment in the forest, because understanding where we came from makes everything that happened next mean so much more. I inherited Brookfield Auto Repair from my father when he passed 5 years ago. It's the kind of small-town garage where farmers bring their tractors, soccer moms get their oil changed, and everyone pays their bills eventually, even if it takes 3 months. The building sits on the edge of town, surrounded by Douglas fir trees so tall they block out half the sky. Most days, I love the work. There's something honest about fixing things that are broken, about taking something that won't run and making it purr again. But 3 years ago, when David died in that construction accident, the shop became more than just my livelihood. It became my refuge from a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. I threw myself into work because engines don't ask how you're feeling, and transmissions don't care if you cried yourself to sleep the night before. Celeste handled her father's death differently than I did. Where I retreated into routine, she exploded outward into curiosity about everything. She started reading voraciously, especially history books about our region. She joined the school's archaeology club and began mapping local historical sites for a project that started as homework but became an obsession. Her bedroom walls are covered with hand-drawn maps of the Cascade foothills, marked with old logging camps, abandoned homesteads, and forgotten roads that most people drive past without noticing. "Mom, did you know our whole town used to be different?" she said one evening while I balanced the shop's books at our kitchen table. "Like, completely different. There were military facilities here during World War II that nobody talks about anymore." I looked up from a stack of invoices to see her surrounded by library books and printouts from historical society websites. Her dark hair fell across her face as she bent over a 1940s survey map, tracing roads with her finger. "There were training camps all through this area," she continued. "Soldiers practiced mountain warfare here before shipping out to Europe. Some of the old access roads are still there, but they're not on any current maps." This is how our Saturday adventures started. Celeste would research historical sites during the week, and on weekends, we'd pack our hiking gear and go looking for traces of the past. At first, I went along because I wanted to spend time with my daughter. After David died, I was terrified of losing connection with the only family I had left. These explorations became our special time together, just the two of us discovering places that time forgot. We found remnants of old logging operations, stone foundations from homesteads built in the 1800s, and once, incredibly, a perfectly preserved 1930s Ford truck that had been abandoned so deep in the woods that it had become part of the landscape. That discovery taught us both something important. The forest keeps secrets, and sometimes those secrets are worth finding. The morning we found the military truck, Celeste had been particularly excited about exploring a section of forest near what used to be called Camp Mitchell, a temporary military installation that operated from 1941 to 1945. The camp was dismantled after the war, but Celeste had found references to access roads that might still be passable. "The thing about military installations," she explained as we hiked that morning, "is that they built things to last, even the temporary stuff. If we can find the old roads, we might find other things too." I remember thinking how much she sounded like her father when she got excited about a project. David had the same way of talking with his hands, the same enthusiasm for discovering how things worked or why they existed. Watching Celeste explore the world with that same passionate curiosity was both heartbreaking and healing. The trail we followed that day wasn't really a trail at all, just a depression in the forest floor that might have once been a road. We walked for about 40 minutes, pushing through undergrowth that hadn't been disturbed in decades, following Celeste's instincts more than any actual path. I was getting ready to suggest we turn back when Celeste stopped dead in her tracks and pointed through the trees. That's when we saw the flash of military green that would change everything we thought we knew about the past and everything we hoped for the future. What we discovered inside that truck turned our simple Saturday adventure into something that would consume the next 3 months of our lives. The driver's side door opened with a rusty groan that echoed through the forest. I expected to find the typical remnants of abandonment, maybe some old tools, scattered papers destroyed by weather, or nothing at all. Instead, the cab looked like someone had stepped out yesterday and planned to come right back. A military-issued compass sat on the dashboard, its brass surface tarnished but intact. A water canteen hung from a hook behind the passenger seat, and when I lifted it, I could hear liquid sloshing inside. Most unsettling of all, a wool military blanket lay folded neatly on the bench seat, as if someone had just finished using it. "Mom, look at this," Celeste said, reaching under the dashboard. She pulled out a canvas pouch containing what appeared to be personal effects. A few dollars in old bills, a small notebook with entries dated 1971, and a dog tag attached to a chain that had somehow escaped the rust that claimed everything else metal in the truck. I took the dog tag from her hands and read the stamped information. MITCHELL, James R.B. 3,151,949 Catholic. The metal was warm from Celeste's touch, but holding it felt like touching something sacred that we had no right to disturb. "There's something else," Celeste said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. She reached behind the sun visor and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but remarkably preserved. Written across the front in careful block letters were the words, "For Tommy if something happens." That envelope changed everything. This wasn't just an abandoned truck anymore. This was someone's final message, someone's last connection to the world they were leaving behind. The weight of what we had stumbled onto hit me like a physical blow. "We need to leave this alone," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew it was too late. Celeste was already opening the notebook, reading entries that were never meant for our eyes. "Mom, listen to this," she said, reading from a page dated March 15, 1971. "Can't go back tomorrow. Can't face them after what happened to Danny. Tommy will understand eventually. Going to make something beautiful for Danny where no one can tear it down or forget." My hands were shaking as I took the notebook from her. The handwriting was neat, controlled, but the words painted a picture of someone in tremendous emotional pain. Entry after entry described guilt, responsibility for a brother's death, and plans to create some kind of memorial in the deep woods. "We have to find out what happened," Celeste said, but I was already shaking my head. "No, we don't. We need to report this to the sheriff and let the proper authorities handle it." "The proper authorities had 50 years to figure this out," she shot back, and I realized my daughter had inherited more than just her father's curiosity. She had his stubborn streak too. That night, while I tried to convince myself we should stay out of whatever tragedy we had stumbled into, Celeste was upstairs on her laptop, researching James R. Mitchell. By morning, she had found newspaper articles from March 1971 about a missing soldier who had disappeared during home leave. The headlines told a story of a decorated veteran who had simply vanished, leaving his family with no answers and no closure. "His truck was reported stolen from the decommissioned base," Celeste announced over breakfast, spreading printouts across our kitchen table. "But look at this, Mom. James Mitchell was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in Vietnam. His younger brother Danny was killed in action in 1970, and his older brother Thomas reported him missing." She slid a grainy newspaper photo across the table. Two young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Local brothers James and Thomas Mitchell before deployment." "Thomas Mitchell still lives here," Celeste said quietly. "He's 73 years old, and according to the phone directory, he never moved away from the address listed in the missing person report." Looking at that photograph, seeing those young faces full of hope and brotherhood, I realized we had stumbled into a story that was much bigger than a restored truck. We had found the missing piece of a family's 50-year-old heartbreak, and my daughter was absolutely right about one thing. We couldn't pretend we had never found it. The argument lasted 3 days. Celeste wanted to drive straight to Thomas Mitchell's house and hand him the envelope. I wanted to call the sheriff and let someone else deal with whatever tragedy we had uncovered. Neither of us was willing to compromise until Thursday evening, when Celeste said something that changed my mind completely. "What if it was Dad's truck we found?" she asked quietly. We were sitting in the shop after hours, and she was helping me organize parts inventory, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. "What if Dad had left us a message before he died, and some stranger found it 50 years from now? Wouldn't you want them to bring it home?" I stopped sorting bolts and looked at my daughter. Sometimes she said things that reminded me so forcefully of David that it took my breath away. This was one of those moments. "Okay," I said, "but we do this right. We don't just show up at this man's door with his brother's belongings and hope for the best. We restore that truck first. We honor James Mitchell's memory by bringing his vehicle back to life." The decision felt right the moment I said it. As a mechanic, I understood that some things need to be fixed before they can be properly returned. James Mitchell had hidden that truck in the forest for a reason, but he had also maintained it carefully before abandoning it. The least we could do was finish what he started. The next morning, we drove back to the forest with my truck and trailer. Loading the M37 was a challenge that required winches, chains, and 3 hours of careful maneuvering, but we managed to get it back to the shop without damaging anything important. Once we had it under proper lighting, I could see the extent of the restoration work ahead of us. The engine was seized but not destroyed. The electrical system needed complete rewiring. The body panels required sandblasting and repainting. Most challenging of all, finding period-correct replacement parts for a 1952 military vehicle meant hours of research and phone calls to specialty dealers across the country. "This is going to cost us," I warned Celeste as we drew up a preliminary budget. "Parts, paint, labor time, we're talking about $3,000 minimum, maybe more." "So we use some of Dad's life insurance money," she said without hesitation. "He always said that money was supposed to help us do important things. This feels important." She was right, and we both knew it. David would have loved this project. He had always been fascinated by military history, and the idea of reuniting a veteran with his brother's memory would have appealed to his sense of justice. We started with the engine. I taught Celeste how to rebuild a carburetor while she researched the specifications for military paint colors. We spent evenings reading about the M37's service history and its role in the Korean War. Every bolt we turned, every component we restored, felt like we were not just fixing a truck, but preserving a piece of someone's story. 3 weeks into the restoration, Celeste made another discovery. While cleaning out the spare tire compartment, she found a small metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a Purple Heart medal and a photograph of 3 young men in military uniforms. Someone had written on the back, "Tommy, Jimmy, and Danny Mitchell brothers forever 1969. There were 3 brothers, Celeste whispered, holding the photograph carefully. Not just Tommy and Jimmy, there was Danny too. The photograph changed our understanding of everything. Danny looked younger than his brothers, maybe 18 or 19. His smile was broad and confident, the kind of expression that belongs to someone who believes he's invincible. Looking at that photograph, knowing that Danny had died in Vietnam and that James had blamed himself, made our restoration work feel even more sacred. We're not just giving Thomas his brother's truck back, I realized. We're giving him all 3 brothers back. As we worked through the final weeks of restoration, I found myself thinking about family, about the bonds between brothers, and about the weight of survivors' guilt. Every evening when we cleaned up the shop, Celeste and I talked about what we would say to Thomas Mitchell, how we would approach him, what his reaction might be. Neither of us was prepared for what actually happened when we finally knocked on his door. Thomas Mitchell's house sat at the end of a gravel driveway lined with overgrown blackberry bushes. The mailbox was faded, the lawn needed cutting, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of too many Oregon winters. But the moment he opened the door, I recognized him instantly from the photograph. 73 years old, gray-haired and weathered, but unmistakably the same person who had stood with his arms around his brothers 54 years earlier. His reaction to seeing the restored M37 on our trailer was immediate and devastating. He gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white, and for a moment I thought he might collapse. His face went through a series of emotions I couldn't read: shock, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Deep in the Cascade Forest, about 15 miles northeast of town," Celeste answered gently. "We've spent 3 months restoring it. We found some personal items inside that we thought you should have." Thomas stepped onto his porch, moving like a man walking toward his own execution. When he reached the truck, he placed both hands on the hood and stood there silently for what felt like forever. I could see tears running down his cheeks, but his expression was unreadable. "I looked for this truck for 20 years, he finally said. "Every weekend, every vacation day I had, I drove those forest roads looking for where Jimmy went. I thought maybe if I could find him, I could understand why he left us." Celeste pulled the canvas bag from our truck and handed it to Thomas. He opened it slowly, examining the dog tag, the compass, the notebook, and finally the sealed envelope with his name on it. His hands were shaking as he tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. I watched his face as he read, seeing 50 years of questions getting answered in real time. When he finished, he looked up at us with an expression of profound grief mixed with something that might have been relief. "He didn't abandon us," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Jimmy didn't run away, he was trying to build something." Thomas told us the story we had only pieced together in fragments. James had come home from Vietnam carrying impossible guilt about encouraging their youngest brother Danny to enlist. Danny had died in his first month of combat, and James blamed himself completely. Unable to face returning to active duty and unable to live with the weight of his guilt, James had taken the truck and disappeared into the forest. The letter says he was going to create a memorial for Danny somewhere beautiful and hidden, where no one could disturb it or tear it down. He wanted to make a place where Danny could rest in peace, away from all the politics and anger about the war. But Thomas's next revelation shattered everything we thought we understood about the story. "Follow me," he said, walking toward the tree line behind his house. "There's something you need to see." We followed him down a barely visible path through dense woods for about 10 minutes until we reached a small clearing I never would have found on my own. In the center stood the most heartbreaking and beautiful memorial I had ever seen. James had arranged stones in perfect military formation, creating a symbolic cemetery with Danny's name carved into a large granite boulder at the head. A flagpole made from a straight pine trunk held a carefully folded American flag, somehow still intact after 50 years. Most stunning of all, James had built a small shelter around the memorial using branches and military canvas, protecting it from weather while keeping it hidden from the world. "I found this place in 1995, Thomas said quietly. 24 years after Jimmy disappeared, but I never found him." He led us to the far edge of the clearing, where a second, smaller stone memorial bore the inscription, James R. Mitchell 19, 491971. He found his way home. "Jimmy's buried here," Thomas said simply. "He built this place for Danny, lived here for probably 6 months based on what I found, and then he joined his little brother. He left me another letter explaining everything, asking me to forgive him and to take care of this place." Standing in that hidden clearing, understanding the full scope of what James had created and sacrificed, I finally grasped the magnitude of what we had stumbled into. This wasn't just about returning a truck. This was about a brother's 50-year journey from anger and abandonment to understanding and peace. Standing in that sacred clearing, watching Thomas Mitchell finally speak his brother's names without pain, I understood that some discoveries change everyone involved in ways you never see coming. "I want the truck to stay here," Thomas said, gesturing toward the memorial site. "Jimmy created this place for Danny, but it belongs to all three of them now. The truck should be part of it." Over the following weeks, we helped Thomas transform the hidden memorial into something even more beautiful than James had originally envisioned. We cleared additional paths, installed weatherproof cases for the personal items we had found, and positioned the restored M37 so it overlooked both memorial stones like a guardian watching over fallen soldiers. But the most profound change wasn't to the memorial site, it was to Thomas himself. For 50 years, he had lived with the belief that his younger brother had abandoned their family in their moment of greatest grief. That belief had shaped every relationship, every decision, every day of his life since 1971. Learning the truth about James's sacrifice didn't erase the pain of losing both brothers, but it transformed that pain from bitter abandonment into profound love and respect. "I spent 5 decades angry at the wrong person," Thomas told us as we installed a bronze plaque honoring all 3 Mitchell brothers. "I was angry at Jimmy for leaving when I should have been angry at a war that destroyed so many families. Jimmy didn't abandon us. He loved us so much that he couldn't figure out how to keep living." The transformation in our own lives was just as dramatic. What began as a weekend adventure had become something much deeper, a lesson about the difference between fixing things and healing them. As a mechanic, I thought I understood restoration. I thought it was about taking something broken and making it work again. But James Mitchell's truck taught me that sometimes restoration is about taking something beautiful that was lost and helping it find its way home. Celeste learned something different but equally important. Her obsession with solving the mystery had started as teenage curiosity, but it became something much more meaningful, an understanding that some stories need to be told, even when they're painful, because the people left behind deserve to know the truth. "I used to think history was just stuff that happened to other people a long time ago," she said during one of our final visits to the memorial site. "But this made me understand that history is always personal. Every story belongs to someone, and every mystery that goes unsolved leaves someone wondering and hurting." Thomas became a regular presence in our lives after that summer. He started joining our weekend exploration adventures, sharing stories about his brothers, and helping us understand the broader history of military families in our region. He had decades of loneliness to make up for, and Celeste and I had space in our lives for the kind of family connection that only comes from shared experience and mutual healing. 6 months after we found the truck, Thomas asked us to help him organize the first annual Mitchell Brothers Memorial Day ceremony at the site. Families of other local veterans began joining us, and what started as a private memorial became a community gathering that honors not just Danny and James, but all the soldiers who never made it home, and all the families still wondering what happened to their loved ones. The ceremony has become one of the most important events in our town's calendar. But for me, the real miracle happens every time I see Thomas speak publicly about his brothers. The man who hadn't said their names aloud for 50 years now tells their story with pride and love, helping other families understand that healing sometimes requires learning truths that are difficult to accept. I think about James Mitchell often, especially when I'm working on particularly challenging restoration projects in my shop. He spent 6 months in those woods, alone with his grief, trying to create something beautiful enough to honor his brother's memory. He succeeded in ways he never lived to understand. The memorial he built didn't just honor Danny. It eventually healed the family he thought he had abandoned. Sometimes the most broken things we find aren't meant to be fixed. Sometimes they're meant to teach us that love persists even when everything else falls apart, and that the most important restorations happen not to machines or monuments, but to the human hearts that have been carrying damage for far too long. That's the real story of the military truck we found hidden in the Oregon woods, and why bringing it home made a 73-year-old veteran cry tears of relief instead of sorrow.